and I'd like to welcome everybody this evening, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you here, and welcome to the people joining us by Zoom as well. And this will also be recorded, so if you have friends that would benefit from it later, we hope to have that available as well. I have the distinct privilege of being aunt to a very special young lady. Deirdre grew up in rural Saskatchewan, but came to Ontario regularly to visit Oma and Tansadafna. Anyway, she did her medical training at UBC, did her residency at University of Saskatoon, and did a fellowship at Sunnybrook, specializing in orthopedic trauma surgery. Subsequently did fellowship in Perth, Australia, yes, and various other things. And then for the last 10 years, she has been exclusively involved in humanitarian medicine in war-torn countries. She has been to Syria, Burundi, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Haiti, Iraq, anyway, and Gaza for a year and a half through COVID, and formed some pretty incredible bonds there with colleagues both in Doctors Without Borders and the local people there. And so Gaza in particular has a very soft spot in Deirdre's heart. She was back there in October of this year, and she's going back next week. So she will share some of her experiences.
I'm quite impressed that somebody other than myself has memorized my CV, because I keep having to think hard and think, did I just miss something? So thank you very much, everybody that's here, for coming here today. We don't have our room mics on, so if you at the back are having any trouble hearing me, just sort of wave a hand from time to time, and I'll try to remember to keep the volume up. And I'm hoping that we've got our online sound issues settled here, and all of you online can hear me.
Recording in progress.
And just to get one thing out of the way as an official kind of thing, I'm just here as me. I'm not here as a representative of any official organization. I'm not a spokesperson for anything. This is just me as Deirdre, with you as yourselves. One moment while I figure out how to advance the slides. There we go. I was listening to this song the other day, and these lyrics brought me to tears. So I cannot read them all out for you, even though it's a little bit small, because I will cry, and then we will not get any further on in this presentation than right now, which is not what you came here for. But it's an old song, and it's one that comes out of the women's suffrage movement, the early labor movement and the civil liberties movement in the US. And it's called Bread and Roses. And it's about the importance, not just about the bare necessities that we need to survive, but also those things that make us human. And one of the lines is, "Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses." I could tell you about 1,000 stories about Gaza that have to do with bread and that have to do with roses. So this is Gaza on the map that you see here. 40 kilometers long, 15 kilometers wide as its widest. It's tiny if we think of Canadian geography. I think there are people who drove more than that distance to get here today. It's home to 2.3 million people, all of them Palestinian, with the occasional visitor like me. For myself, I first went to Gaza in 2019. And I went back again in 2020 and back another time in 2021. In all, I stayed for a year and a half working with Doctors Without Borders. So if you look at the map, if you look by the letter G up there, you see a yellow dot. That's where I lived. And above that, the red dot, that's Al Auda Hospital in Jabalia, and that's where I was working. Sometimes it can be quite hard to express what Gaza was like during those times because it was a place of such massive contrasts. Maybe you can see how significant those contrasts were if you think that these two photos were taken on the same day in May of 2019. On the right, the result of an Israeli airstrike in Gaza City. On the left are doctors and nurses at the hospital putting in, from what you could see from close up, a normal day at work. At that time, hospitals in Gaza, they didn't look all that different from our hospitals here. But if you were to go to the storage rooms or back to the pharmacies and the warehouses, you would find that those hospitals were 1 month away from running out of 50% of the essential medications. I was doing my groceries every week at well-stocked supermarkets that had everything from gluten-free items to maple syrup. But every time we went to work, we would also pass the UNRWA food distribution center, and there would be people picking up their bags of rice and lentils with their donkey carts. That was food aid without which they would not have survived. A few mornings a week, I used to go for a 10-kilometer run up and down the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. But many of the colleagues that I was working with had not left that tiny area of the Gaza Strip in more than 12 years because of a siege that was imposed by Israel and by Egypt. My colleagues were well educated, they were well dressed, and they were very well experienced in treating patients who are injured by the weapons of war. They used to tell me stories sometimes about 2014, when rockets from Gaza killed six civilians in Israel, and about 70 Israeli soldiers were killed. 800 people in Israel were wounded. Dr. Hafez and Dr. Obaid told me what it was like during those 50 days to be in Gaza. In Gaza at that time, more than 2,000 people were killed. They were struggling to try to treat the 10,000 people in Gaza who were wounded. 5 years after that, it was 2019, and I was meeting them for the first time. It was in the middle of the Great March of Return. People in Gaza were demonstrating along the border with Israel. They were demanding that the siege on Gaza be lifted. They were asking to return to their homes because more than 70% of people in Gaza are refugees, or the children or the grandchildren of refugees who fled there from what is now Israel into Gaza in 1948 and again in 1967. During those protests in 2018 and 2019, the vast majority of protesters were unarmed. But the Israeli soldiers on the other side of the fence were all armed. Over 8,000 people in Gaza were injured because they were shot with live ammunition from high-velocity sniper rifles during that year and a half from 2018 to 2019, and 223 people were killed. On the Israeli side, either 0 or 1 person was killed, and between 4 and 11 were injured, depending on what source you read, as a direct result of those protests. These are some of the Doctors Without Borders waiting rooms from that time in Gaza. And this is one of those 8,000 people. This is Mohammed Saad. He rushed to the border in September of 2018 when he heard that his son had been injured. Seconds after he found the 15-year-old boy, an Israeli soldier shot him too. He had 10 operations to try to save his leg, but eventually amputation was the only option for him. He was worried at first about the stigma that amputation would carry, but he said, "My wife and my family have shown me love and encouragement throughout. My wife is definitely the main reason I accepted the amputation and the challenges that come with it." Treating severe injuries like those, this was not something that I learned to do in my training in Canada, but this was something that Obaid and Hafez had been doing all throughout their careers. Obaid is the single most skilled orthopedic surgeon I've ever worked with, and the same for Dr. Hafez in terms of plastic reconstructive surgery. So when we were in Gaza together, they took care of the patients. I took care of the administrative side of things, the management, the patient flow, the logistics, the communication, the ordering new supplies, the writing emails, the making spreadsheets, the stuff that's not very interesting for most surgeons. But if it meant that I could help those two guys work better, it was well worth doing. And at the same time, I made sure that I learned from them. And I went on to use the techniques that I learned from those two surgeons to treat patients in Afghanistan and in the Central African Republic. And in Iraq, I used those same skills to train a group of Iraqi surgeons who were dealing with patients who had similar severe limb injuries like we were dealing with in Gaza. So that's why I spent 1.5 years in Gaza, because together we made an amazing team. And because the surgeons in Gaza were helping me learn what I needed to learn to treat patients in other parts of the world. Obaid and I became very good friends early on, and we always keep in touch, even when I'm not in Gaza. And when you see him, he's this gruff, burly man. But it doesn't take long to realize that the exterior does not reflect the interior in this man. Any time that he was sitting idle, he'd find a pen, he'd find a scrap of paper, or in this case, a mask, and he would start to draw. He's a beautiful artist, and he decorated this mask, which he gave to me, and I have it still, carefully stored in a special place at home. He drew a bird, he drew a Picafia pattern, he drew the letter D for me, and he drew a rose. I was working most closely with those surgeons, but of course, when a patient has a severe injury like ours had, they need to have care from head down to toe. They need everything from mental health support, physiotherapy, patient education, occupational therapy. So we needed nurses, we needed microbiologists, we needed infectious disease specialists because everybody had an infection. We needed people to keep the hospital clean, and we needed to keep it well maintained, all of the machines running. Somebody to run the pharmacy, somebody to order and install new equipment. So it took a whole hospital to heal those patients, not just a couple of surgeons. And that team in Gaza, that multidisciplinary team, was absolutely exemplary. I've never worked with such a big clinical team or one that was so cohesive as this one was. And it's also a Palestinian team. So like most humanitarian projects, 90% of the team was from Gaza, working in Gaza, with just a handful of international staff helping out. Of course, you need leaders within any team. And Obaid, the surgeon, was one of those, also Hafez. They were natural leaders and ones that acknowledged the importance of every other team member. Rami is another one of those leaders, the nursing supervisor in the operating department. You knew with Rami, if you asked him anything, it would be done. And no matter how busy he was, when you asked him to do something extra, he would just say, "Give me more." And then he'd go and he'd get it done. No matter how busy he was, no matter how run off his feet, Rami kept his desk beautiful. I have never anywhere in the world seen an operating supervisor's desk decorated with fresh roses every day. But that is what you could expect on Rami's desk. But you had to be careful if you were going to tell him how beautiful they were, because as soon as I admired his roses, he would insist on giving them to me. And that's what happened on this day in this blurry picture. Rami surrounded by a surgeon, a nurse, and a psychologist, all of us holding a perfect rosebud that he had originally intended to put on his desk, but which he insisted on sending home with each of us. So Rami and the other staff at the hospital were always making it more beautiful, and they were always making sure that everyone was very well fed, whether it was a question of every morning the discussion, do we order rice and chicken or do we reorder rice and meat? And the careful attention paid to everyone's birthday so that we could have a cake and share it out amongst the staff. In the office as well, I was surrounded by beauty, in the form of beautiful souls like Khulud, who's the data manager for Doctors Without Borders. And if you meet Khulud, she comes across as the opposite of Obaid. She's very sweet, she's very delicate. But if you come between her and her data, you are in trouble. She's a self-taught IT genius, and she's a very, very driven career woman, and she's fiercely protective of her programs. But every day on her way to work, she would pick a little sprig of jasmine, and she'd give it to me every single day to put in my pocket and smell throughout the morning. So it's fitting that one of the goodbye presents I received from my team of doctors when I was in Gaza was a little plaque embroidered with roses. It had my name in the center and theirs around it. Ranin, Hafez, Obaid, Al-Makadma, Al-Baraika, Osama, Al-Nujella, and Al-Najjar. They gave it to me when we were sitting on a rooftop restaurant from which you could see most of Gaza City. And the last time that I was in Gaza, during that period, I took a photo from that same rooftop. This is Gaza City, May 22nd, 2022. And that is the Gaza I knew, beautiful and vibrant. It's not okay. It still has crushing levels of poverty and unemployment. There are still 2.3 million people trapped inside that tiny area. There would be the constant sound of Israeli drones flying overhead that almost never went away. These weren't weaponized drones, not yet, but surveillance drones. And they came with a constant buzz, like you had a mosquito trapped in your bedroom, but a mosquito that you knew was watching you. This is roughly the same area of downtown Gaza City. The tallest building that you see on the left is that one tall building that's still standing there on the right. That photo was taken on the 10th of October, 2023. So there's a full year between when that photo was taken and the most recent time I went back to Gaza. These are some of the things that happened during that year, when I wasn't physically in Gaza, but where it felt like my every waking thought was with my friends and my colleagues and my patients who were still there. So Rami, that capable nurse who had managed to do anything that you needed of him, he has been asked to do terrible things this last year. One of those was to evacuate the Doctors Without Borders hospital in 2 hours. Imagine evacuating anywhere in 2 hours, but especially a hospital where you have patients that can't walk. You have machinery and equipment that is priceless in a context where you know more patients will be injured and need care at any moment. 2 hours is what the Israeli army initially demanded. Eventually, they extended that deadline. They gave our team 1 night. And the team did manage to evacuate the hospital. Rami took this photo and sent it to all of us who are anxiously watching around the globe. And he wrote, "We evacuate. Everyone is in the street." And until that moment, I had never seen Rami look so crushed. Our staff voluntarily returned to that hospital to keep it open and to make sure that the people who had stayed in that neighborhood had access to medical care. They were surgeons like our Dr. Obaid and nurses like Sami and Sanabel and Samar, but also the lab technicians, the cleaners, the maintenance staff, the ambulance drivers. They all returned voluntarily to make sure that people still had access to care. And so did doctors, like Dr. Mahmoud, who's the tall guy at the back in both of these photos. Mahmoud and I have been good friends for years. And like Hafez and Obaid and Rami, he's a natural leader. And I used to always try to get him to take my job as a manager because he would have been great at it. But he always said, no, I don't want to manage anything. I don't like email. I want to stay with the patients. And he was very good at that too. He was also an invaluable source of feedback for me, and I used to sit with him and have a cup of coffee, and he'd tell me when he thought that I was managing things unfairly, usually when I was taking the side of the surgeons, which I would say was probably always true, and I would try to rectify my preference and my preferential treatment within the team. He'd tell me if he thought that there was friction between 2 team members that I wasn't picking up on, that I needed to deal with. And so he and I kept in touch even when I wasn't in Gaza. And that's how I know that he was one of the ones who went back to keep our hospital open. He wrote me for advice about his patients during that time. His patients included 4 orphans, Lina and Kusai and Abdurrahman, and a little girl who was 7 months old. I don't even know if Mahmoud knew her name. I don't know if there was anybody who could tell him her name. He also wrote to me and asked for advice about how to tell an injured woman that her daughter had been killed in an airstrike after he had wrapped the little baby himself in a white shroud. Some of you might recognize this message. Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Remember us. It's dated the 20th of October, 2023, and the signature just above that is Dr. Mahmoud's. Mahmoud was killed 1 month after he wrote and signed that message on our hospital whiteboard. I used to try to tell him that he was a hero, and he refused to listen to me. He said that he was only doing what was right. There have been over 600 attacks on healthcare facilities in Gaza these past 16 months, but there have been no documented cases where Hamas or any other militant group was using the hospital in a way that constituted a threat to the Israeli forces. And that's international law. A hospital is a protected space unless that threshold is met. And even if that threshold were to have been met, there are requirements. The hospital has to be given time to evacuate, not 2 hours. The patients need to be evacuated to somewhere where they can receive care, not to a street. And any attack on the hospital must be militarily necessary, and it must be proportionate. But the level of destruction that we have seen of the Gaza healthcare system has not been at all consistent with that. Mahmoud is one of 1,000 Palestinian healthcare workers in Gaza who have been killed in Israeli military attacks during the last year and a half. He's one of 1,000 healthcare workers and one of more than 46,000 Palestinians who have been killed. I don't like numbers, and I don't like graphs, and I don't like statistics, because we're talking about human lives. And those shouldn't be reduced to such cold, hard facts. But we also need a way to represent how many names and how many faces and how many stories are we talking about when we talk about these deaths. We need to inform ourselves about the magnitude and about the proportions. So this is a graph that shows you, since the year 2000, how many Israelis have been killed by Palestinians in blue, and how many Palestinians have been killed by Israelis in red. And so when you look at the right side of that graph, you see that spike in Israelis who have been killed by Palestinians in 2023. That's those October 7th Hamas attacks and their immediate aftermath. But you actually have to take out those last 15 months and redraw that graph with a new y-axis to actually visualize the statistics on Israeli victims for the last 20 years, because the scale makes them disappear. So here's that same graph from 2000 until 2023, without the 46,000 Palestinians from the last 1.5 years. My orthopedic surgeon friend, Dr. Obaid, was not harmed in that attack on our hospital, and so he kept on working. A month later, he was shot in the hand by an Israeli sniper. He was back in the operating room treating other patients that very same day. In a year of genocide, he aged immensely. On the left, the man proudly opening his private clinic. To the right, a selfie that he sent in September last year. Obaid is a little more than a year younger than I am. He has been working nonstop for a year, doing the kinds of surgeries that he taught me to do for patients with incredibly severe injuries. You can see this gap, this void in that central image. That's more than a third of that patient's tibia, their shin bone, that simply is no longer there. But fortunately for that patient, Obaid is there. And if anybody who can reconstruct that gap in the bone, he can. When he ran out of the metal clamps to attach the pins in the bone to the rods that are outside the body, he sat down at his younger daughter's art table and made a drawing of how he could solve the problem. He took that to the hospital's maintenance team, who are still hard at work. They made what he described and they trialed it on a piece of wood. And the next day they used it on this patient. It's a patient whose treatment was delayed because he couldn't reach the hospital for weeks. So that white thing on the left, that's dead bone sticking out of his legs. Obaid cut off that bone, he filled the gap, he covered the wound with tissue, and he put on clamps and rods and pins using what the maintenance guys had made for him. And I'm sorry that for you this might look like a bit of a bloody mess, but for an orthopedic surgeon, what he's done here, this looks absolutely beautiful. More than 100,000 people in Gaza have been wounded in the last year and a half. But there are so many who had already been wounded before. This is Muawiyah, who is one of my patients with Doctors Without Borders that I knew from Gaza years ago. Muawiyah is a barber. And in May of 2021, a missile wounded his neighbor. A piece of shrapnel struck him in the chest. So Muawiyah ran to help. The next attack severed one of Muawiyah's legs and shattered the other one. So this is his old life on the left, with his surgeon and his friend, Dr. Obaid, and in a special barber chair that was made for him so that he could sit and move from one side of his customer to the other. He used to cut the hair of a number of the staff in Doctors Without Borders, and they used to always go back to Obaid and said, "You did a good job," because he still cuts my hair straight. This is Muawiyah's life now on the right. His prosthetic has been damaged and is unusable. And on his one remaining leg, he is wearing a sandal that he has cobbled together from two different shoes. He's been trying to sell sunflower seeds to make just a little bit of money. A year ago, Muawiyah wrote me a beautiful and completely heartrending message about the plight of people with disabilities in Gaza during the genocide. So I contacted several Canadian organizations that assist people with amputations, and I contacted some professional organizations for prosthetists and for rehabilitation specialists to see if I could connect them with Muawiyah and other people in Gaza who are struggling like he is. None of those organizations have ever replied to the messages that I have sent. My non-medical friends and colleagues have continued to work just as hard as they can in Gaza. So Khulud isn't doing computer work anymore in the Doctors Without Borders office. That's her on the right, just outside that office. That street used to be one of the fancy neighborhoods in Gaza. It was full of trees and beautiful houses. Our neighbor who lived there was a dentist. He and his family were Christians, some of about 1,000 Christians who lived in Gaza before the genocide. I don't know how many of his community have been killed, and I don't know if he and his family are still alive. Last summer, Khulud wrote down a brief memoir of her experiences this past year, and she entrusted me with a copy and gave me permission to share it. So these are her words. I had an appointment scheduled with my boss on October the 8th at 8 a.m. to review my work, which was an achievement I was very proud of, but that never happened. I lost my home on October 10th, 2023. I lost my car in November of 2023, which I had paid for with my work earnings. But those things are insignificant in comparison to seeing my children injured in front of my eyes, blood covering my son so I could not see the features of his face. My daughter, when she placed her hands on her chest in pain. My son, holding his hand covered in blood. I saw body parts flying in front of me and falling between my feet. Our relatives were among the wounded and martyred, with bombs exploding and shelling everywhere. I stopped for a few seconds, confused. I did not know what to do, where to go, where to get relief. 100 questions in one moment, and everyone asking me for help. I pulled myself together. Khulud and her husband have 4 children. 2 of her brothers-in-law and 1 sister-in-law have been killed, so she and her husband and 1 other sister-in-law are now raising 11 children between the 3 of them. I am strong for my family, she often tells me. She is also strong for the rest of Gaza. There's no computer work to do right now, so she's designing water sanitation projects. Again, just like with her computer work, it's completely self-taught. But she gets praise from the Doctors Without Borders staff who are supporting her from Jordan. And as always, she continues to take great personal pride in the good work that she can do. So last October 2024, I was back in Gaza for 1 more month, this time at European Gaza Hospital in Khan Yunis, which is the blue dot down at the bottom of the map there. I wasn't working with Doctors Without Borders this time, but with a Norwegian charity called Norwak. I took 4 photos between the border and the hospital when we drove into Gaza last fall. These are those 4 photos. A government school where the walls are scorched and there are holes from mortars, and you can see laundry hanging in the window because, of course, it's no longer a school, but a place where thousands of people are taking shelter. 2 mosques completely collapsed, and a 4th building that I don't even know what it is. And it was kilometer after kilometer after kilometer of that, and even worse, coming into Gaza. So you can imagine my surprise when we finally reached the hospital, and the hospital looked like this. European Gaza Hospital has only been bombed by the Israeli army once. They forced its evacuation, but they never invaded it. And I have this absolutely bizarre feeling every time I talk about it that I'm almost apologizing that my hospital was only bombed once. Whereas surely we should all be in a rage that any hospital was ever bombed once. So it is the most intact and the most functional hospital in Gaza. As I've followed the news over the last year and a half, I've seen the names of hospitals where I visited, hospitals where I received patients from. Beit Hanun, Kamal Adwan, Al Auda, Indonesian, Hamad Hospital, Al Shifa, Al Ahli, Al Aqsa, Turkish, Yemeni, Al Nasser, all destroyed and put out of commission one by one. None of them look anything like this hospital. There are NGO field hospitals, Doctors Without Borders has one, but they are a tiny drop in the bucket, 100 beds here and there, replacing what used to be hospitals with hundreds of beds inside them. So in that hospital and in the nursing college next door, that's where my home was for a month last autumn. And alongside the 3 Norwegians that I was working with, these 3 guys became my new family. They're the guards and the caretakers of the nursing college where we were sleeping. Shadi and Mohammed and Rafat were always trying to share food with us. We had brought enough Norwegian dehydrated hiking food to feed us for a month. And so we would always try to insist that they keep their food because we knew how hard it was to get, how expensive, and eventually how impossible it was to obtain. But still, that Palestinian hospitality, they really wanted to share. And when I told this story to a friend in Canada, I'd been in tears one day because they had come with this photo on the left with a bowl full of beans and eggs and halva, which is made out of sesame paste. And it was a tray full of such nutritious food and such protein-rich food and calorie-rich food. And they had insisted that as their guests, that we should take it from them and we should eat it. And I teared up many times in that month in Gaza, but that was the only time that I cried, when those men came and gave us that food. And when I shared that story with a friend in Gaza, in Canada, she said, of course you cried. That those Gazan men cared so much that they shared what they did not have. Their hearts were so generous, and their spirits remained gracious, despite what the Israeli government and the rest of the world are doing to them. In the last days of that month in Gaza, Shadi and Mohammed and Rafat, they actually did start to accept food from us, which is completely against the rules of normal Palestinian hospitality. But at that point, they had nothing. At the hospital as well, I was met with generosity every single day. This is Hannah, who was running the scheduling of the operating room. And she would always try to give me half of her breakfast. She'd put some falafel in a pita and try to give it to me. And so I would take a tiny bite and hand it back to her and run away, claiming that I had something to do. And in those last days in Gaza as well, Hannah told me how she had completely run out of flour and she had to stand in line for hours to receive some bread to take home for her children. Hannah runs the operating room on weekdays. And so here she is, these slightly sheepish-looking young men are the junior surgeons, and Hannah has been making sure that they're doing their paperwork properly, which is no easy task. But Hannah was used to running things and making sure that people do what they're supposed to do, because at work, she runs the OR desk, and at home, she's the mom of 7. Her oldest is 19, and Odai should have taken his high school exams last spring. Hannah was very proud when she told me that Odai and his 2 teenage sisters consistently got the highest marks in their high school classes. And the way that things work in Gaza, your high school graduating marks determine what career you can follow. And all the students with the highest marks enter medicine. So that means that it takes about a 99, 98 point something to get into med school. And if that had been me in grade 12, life would have taken a very different path. But for Odai, his year could not sit their exams. In Gaza, education is valued very, very highly, and the Gaza Strip has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. It's 99% for youth between 15 and 24 years old, 97% for the whole adult population. I tried to compare with Canada, but we report our statistics a bit differently in terms of literacy. But what I did find was that in 2023, 44% of young Gazans who were between 18 and 24 years old were in university or college. And 44% is the same rate that we had in Canada for that age range at the same time. Obviously, the systemic destruction of the education system over the last year and a half is going to have a devastating impact on that. Hannah and her husband have hoped that Odai can go back and complete his studies. And for a while, when it was still possible for Gazan people to leave and escape into Egypt for a fee of $5,000 per person, Hannah and her husband tried to collect that money so that they could send Odai to Egypt. And they hoped that from there he could go somewhere, anywhere that he could study. But they didn't manage to get the money together before April, which is when Israeli troops destroyed the Rafah border crossing. And until this time, the only way for a Palestinian person to get out of Gaza is as a medically evacuated patient or their caretaker. And for those two, far too few people are being allowed to exit. A lot of my time in Gaza was spent working with junior doctors. We had very few senior orthopedic staff in the hospital. Those junior doctors themselves were still in training. They were still studying. They were still, believe it or not, writing exams. And they were still asking me to teach them new techniques. they were unbelievably enthusiastic and helpful. Some of them would have been amongst the most keen learner in any environment, even if you didn't consider that they were just struggling to survive from day to day. And some of these guys have since passed their exam. They wrote me happy messages in December saying that they're done, they're fully qualified, they're now orthopedic surgeons just like me. When I compare the drama to which I assigned my fifth-year orthopedic exams and how I left off all of life except for studying in order to pass them, and the fact that someone has done this in the midst of a genocide, is beyond impressive to me, and is a dedication to learning and to medicine that I don't think can be paralleled in any other place in the world at the moment. The things that those residents have lived through, they often didn't speak about, but occasionally they would give me a little glimpse into what their lives as trainees had been like. And one afternoon, one resident, Dr. Abdullah, was describing to me how he had been forced to leave Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City and then come down to European Gaza Hospital in the winter of 2023. And he told me about the last patient he treated in Al-Shifa and the first patient that he treated in European Gaza Hospital. And I wrote down, after he told me this, as closely as I could remember, what his words were. He told me, it was a child, a 3-year-old child with an explosive injury. The femur is gone. Gone. There's no femur. The only thing connecting the leg of this child is the femoral artery. The plan was hip disarticulation, which means removing the entire leg at the level of the pelvis. Abdullah said, I could not do it. Then I evacuated. Here, the first case that found me was a child, 5 years old, bilateral amputation, one side below the knee, the other side above, 5 years old. Both of us were silent for a few minutes. And then Abdullah collected himself and he started to ask me questions about our next surgery, and he put those terrible memories aside for a time. These were some of the patients that Abdullah and I were treating together. This is Muawiyah, the same name but a different patient from the Muawiyah, the barber that I told you about before. Young Muawiyah is 26. Shot in both legs, right through the bone and right through the artery. I did 5 surgeries on his legs, and he still needed more to be done after I'd left Gaza. In the other side of the screen, there's Malak. Malak means angel in Arabic. Her leg was broken when a wall fell on her, when her house collapsed and she was trying to escape it. I don't know if it was because of an airstrike or from a tank shell. Malak's mother was particularly worried about taking Malak home because, as she explained to me, it was just the two of them. Muawiyah had the help of a strong younger brother and their dad, who were able to help him despite the fact that he couldn't walk on either leg. But we waited to make sure that Malak could walk and her mother could take care of her before we sent the two of them home. They seemed to feel safe in the hospital. And Muawiyah stayed with us for weeks. Maybe in part they felt safe in the hospital because foreign staff like me were there. Maybe the fact that a Canadian and a few Norwegians were inside the hospital would mean that it was less likely to be attacked. Because certainly not everyone working in a hospital in Gaza has been safe this past year. I already told you how Dr. Mahmoud was killed in the Doctors Without Borders hospital. And on October 22nd last year, when I was in South Gaza, my friend Dr. Obaid was in North Gaza. He had left Al Auda Hospital, which is the place where he and I were working together, to go to Kamal Adwan Hospital, just a few blocks away, which was full of patients who needed him more. He sent a video at that time and a number of messages. This is the video that he sent.
هذا هو حال مأساوي في مستشفى كمال عدوان، تكدس غير طبيعي. هناك أكثر من 150 حالة بين أطفال وكبار مصابين.
دلوقتي مثلا تقولي انه اليومين ما شفت غضب فارس يا دكتور، مش قادر يتحمل دمه نزل.
بين ايدك المكسوره وخلاص.
ابدا. هذه مريم بنت سعيد مطر، صار ضربه جنب جيراننا دار الحواجري، واخذته ضربه في راسها، انفتح راسها، الجمجمه انكسرت عندها. ان شاء الله ربنا ياخذ بيدها ويشفيها ان شاء الله يا رب. ان شاء الله احسن من قبل، ان شاء الله ربنا ياخذ بيدها ويشفيها.
مريم كانت في اطفال صح؟
لا تحت من تحت جبناها هذا والله. لا من هذيك مريم عمر ابو مطر طلعتوها برا.
In his message, he said, "Death is present in all colors and forms at Kamal Adwan Hospital in North Gaza. The bombing does not stop. The shelling does not stop. Neither the artillery, the airstrikes, nor the drone attacks. Even the hospital is targeted. The situation feels like a movie. It doesn't seem real. About 5 days ago, my house was targeted. They blew up the roof and the water tanks completely, but we were on the ground floor, and thankfully only one person was injured. We left several times, moved to different areas, and my family and my neighbors were terrified. I took refuge at Kamal Adwan Hospital with my wife and children, and now I work here and can treat many patients. There are no words to describe the situation at Kamal Adwan Hospital. The situation is catastrophic. The hospital is completely overcrowded. There are injured people everywhere, outside and inside the hospital, and it has no capacity to treat the wounded, neither with medical staff nor with surgical tools. Ambulances cannot move. We can't reach the bodies of civilians, nor can we save those injured in the streets. Many died before they could reach the hospital, and others died inside because we couldn't treat their injuries. We have more than 30 bodies of martyrs that have arrived at the hospital, and about 130 injured who need urgent medical care. The medical staff is severely exhausted, and some have been injured. We feel hopeless. Words cannot express our situation. We appeal to all countries of the world to look at northern Gaza and end this aggressive siege, which has led to the death of so many. On the 25th of October, Israeli forces invaded Kamal Adwan Hospital. They took 40 male medical staff and they forced them to strip. They interrogated them, and then they released about half of those men. They forced most of the staff and all of the people taking refuge in the hospital, which included many patients, to walk south. The most critical patients were left behind with just a handful of female medical staff to look after them. My friend, my colleague, my teacher, Dr. Mohammed Obeid, was among those 20 medical staff who was not released. Instead, he was taken to Israel and he was imprisoned there. Another graph. These numbers are obviously changing as we speak. Before the recent hostage exchanges of the last few weeks, there were 103 Israelis being held captive in Gaza, and there were 10,400 Palestinians being held captive in Israel. More than half of those Palestinians have not been charged with a crime, and they have not been tried. And more than 2,500 of them are like Dr. Obaid. They've been taken from the Gaza Strip in the last year. So as we see these people freed, when we turn on our news, we see the names and the faces and the stories of the Israeli hostages who have been so wrongly held and for so long. I hope every week that we will hear news that Dr. Obaid is being released. So far it has not come. But when it does come, I doubt that this is the image of Obaid that they will give to you. A doctor who has treated thousands of patients, a father that has been taking care of his 3 young children. For a while in October of 2023, Yazan and Sarah and Siba and Obaid's wife Abir all lived in my old house, in the Doctors Without Borders house in Gaza. Then they started living in hospitals together with Obaid, and they were all with him in Kamal Adwan Hospital when he was abducted. It's now just about 3 months since Obaid was taken. I've heard conflicting reports about where he is. It's either Sde Taiman, a military base, which you may remember having been in the news last year because of reports of rape and torture of Palestinian prisoners. Those reports were given by Israeli doctors who had been working at the facility and who became whistleblowers when they reported this to the media. I've also heard that he is in Ofer prison, which is known for exactly the same thing, and which is where one of Dr. Obaid's very good friends, Dr. Adnan Al-Borsh, was another orthopedic surgeon who we both worked with, who also was kidnapped from Gaza, was killed last spring. Since I've returned from Gaza, there's been a ceasefire. Still, 110 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli troops since that ceasefire. That includes a 5-year-old little girl who was riding on a donkey cart with her family on their way back to the site of their home in the north of Gaza. The number of trucks let in has been less than the agreed upon number. Israeli drones and planes have been seen in the sky over the Gaza Strip during the hours that were agreed as no-fly hours. But yet, when Hamas refused to release the next Israeli hostages unless the ceasefire terms are respected, it was reported as though Hamas is the one that is breaching the contract. And the American and the Israeli governments have threatened to wreak hell on Gaza. Meanwhile, Rami, our always capable nurse, has gone back to the site of his home. This is a photo that he sent to me of the house where he and his wife and their 2 children once lived. So now, like other people in the north, he's struggling to make shelter for himself and his family, to find clean drinking water, to find fuel for a fire, or some place with electricity to recharge his phone. There are no roses left for Rami in that rubble that is now Gaza. But despite the despair that they feel and the hardships that they face, nurses like Rami and like Hannah have spoken to me about how they hope to replant their gardens. I want to finish again with this gift and those 8 names. I knew that this gift was special when I first received it, but this last year and a half has made it mean more than I ever wanted it to. From those 8 physicians, 3 are in exile, unable to return to Gaza even if they want to. Dr. Mohammed Abu Najela, our tall doctor who was killed trying to care for his orphan patients. Dr. Ahmed Al-Makadma, who I did not tell you about, who was shot outside Al-Shifa with his mother, Dr. Yusra. And Dr. Mohammed Obaid, held for 3.5 months in an Israeli jail. So at last we return to the bread and the roses, and the last line of the song, a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. Every day that I'm in Canada, it feels to me more and more about how much we have here, not just in terms of bread, but in terms of those roses, and how important it is that we do what we can to share those glories of life and to also act in such a way that we make it possible for other people to share those things as well. I believe firmly that I am one of the lucky ones because I get to go to Gaza. To me, it's a risk, but it's not a sacrifice because it means that I can extend a hand to a colleague. I can comfort a relative. I can treat a patient. I can cry with people. I can listen to their stories. And it gives me that illusion of doing something that matters. But yet, I know how much it doesn't really matter. You know, to be one doctor in an operating room picking shrapnel out of a child's leg and you hear the explosion that is going to bring your next patients in, there surely are few things in life that are quite that futile. And so this idea that Doctors Without Borders is there, the foreign workers are there, we've sent help, we've sent aid, we've sent doctors, what does any of it matter when bombs have been dropped right up until the 20th of January, when there's a threat of this raining down hell once again onto Gaza, with a government here that continues to support the government of Israel, regardless, it seems, of what it does, with manufacturers here that continue to be allowed to send arms exports on old agreements and to manufacture parts that go into the planes that deliver those bombs onto the heads of Palestinians in Gaza. I write to my MPs these days, and it becomes less of a request and more of a threat. As I say to them, I'm going back. And I use myself to say, don't drop those bombs, those Canadian bombs on my head. But still, I know that the risk to myself is so infinitesimally small compared to the risk of my Palestinian colleagues. So my hope always is to inform people and inspire people and to not traumatize a room full of people and the people that are with us here on Zoom, but to encourage everyone as we go on in our lives, and we have so many things in the daily parts of our lives that you get caught up in that distract us from the bigger picture, to remember the bread and roses that we have and to find a way to share them and to make sure that other people in this world stay alive so that they can appreciate them too. I'm happy to take any questions. The question is, what is one thing that people here in Mount Forest or people on the Zoom, wherever they are, if there's one thing that you could do tomorrow to make a difference, what would you advise? So what I would advise is, I'm going to give you two answers, because not everybody will be I think everybody can do one, and I think most people can do the second. One would be sign a petition. There are a lot of online petitions, and one signature does not mean a lot, but 100 signatures means a great deal. The place that I go, there are many places online that you can go to find petitions. One very good one is Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, which is that middle address on the list there. Also, Jewish Voices for Peace and Independent Jewish Voices are also very good places to go, which have petitions that you can sign. So I would say that I think all of us can sign a petition. The other thing that I would recommend for people to do is tell someone else something that you heard today. So whether it's at coffee with a coworker or if you run into somebody that you know on the street, or you're having a chat with a family member who's not here, pass on one thing that you heard this evening that maybe surprised you or touched you or affected you in some way that maybe they don't know. And then you get them to sign that petition as well. So the question is, what do people in Gaza themselves think about Hamas? And so like anywhere, there's a spectrum of political affiliations and opinions. And so there is everyone from the people who are very against Hamas, who do not feel that they have represented them as a people, and who have greatly disagreed with their actions over the last year, who have felt that they should have given up and not tried to resist, hoping that maybe that would have changed the fate of Gaza. There are people who are at the opposite end of the spectrum who feel that it is important to resist the Israeli occupation, to resist an Israeli invasion, who feel that Gaza had actually been protected in terms of having an occupation that was at a distance. It was in terms of drones, it was in terms of surveillance, in terms of border controls, but it was not this constant incursion that we have seen in the West Bank through prior years. It was not a shrinking of the territory by settlement expansion and by building of walls that cut off Palestinian territory. So you have these very wide spectrum of views, everything in between, and then you also have people whose views have changed over the last year, that under this assault, under a genocide, I'm sure that people who had previously wanted to just more or less maintain the status quo started to have more of a desire to resist, to fight back. As I think one does. I look around Canada sometimes right now, and we feel ourselves threatened, I think, by the United States at the moment. And you see how people respond. You see the emotional attachment. You see that people have changed their ways of thinking, their ways of acting, from a few statements from a president. So the way that people will think and react in response to a genocide, of course, are vastly different from that. But I think it's a little sort of a microcosm of what we can see changes in us if we do feel ourselves threatened. And that's feeling threatened. It's not being threatened. It's not suffering incredible loss personally with her family. So it's very, very divergent. We often get sold this kind of picture that it's 2.3 million Hamas members, that it's 2.3 million terrorists. I mean, of course not. How could a group of 2.3 million people anywhere in the world be homogenous? And even if they were homogenous in some sense, how on earth could we use that to justify a genocide? No, I haven't. So the question is, if you're not hearing it online here, how did I deal with the incredible emotional stress, and have I spoken with any Israelis in Canada? So the emotional stress, I mean, I have a psychiatrist when I'm in Gaza. I have one before I go who's there for me if I need, and at home when I come back. We've got 2 psychiatrists working with a tiny little Norwalk team. When I was working in Gaza, there were 2 psychiatrists for all of the 2.3 million people on the Gaza Strip. So my access to mental health care is far beyond what my Palestinian colleagues have access to, and my level of mental stress is is nowhere near what theirs is, because I only need to worry for myself and the people around me. I know that my family is safe, and I also know that I am far more safe than any of my Palestinian colleagues. I write, I journal, and I think that that has always helped me to put things onto paper, to get them out of my head, to process the things that I'm going through. And I have an absolutely amazing collection of friends and family and colleagues in Canada and around the world that they understand what I'm doing, they support what I'm doing, and so that is an immense source of support. And as odd as it may seem, mentally I felt much better when I was back in Gaza in October and November than I felt being here, because my thoughts are in Gaza. I know full well what's happening in Gaza, and I see life continuing as per normal in Canada, and I feel sometimes that there are maybe colleagues or maybe former friends that they don't want to engage with me on those levels. They just want to keep our friendship, our relationship based on what it had been, or on the normal things. But my normal has changed, and I don't want to go through life blinkered. I still want to go through the whole range of human experience and emotion, because I know that that is what my Palestinian colleagues and friends are striving to do. But I don't want to do that in a bubble or in a created bubble. And so for that, I felt like being in Gaza, life made sense again, that what I was seeing and what I was experiencing and what I knew was happening were all the same again. Whereas in Canada, I had this cognitive dissonance, this constant sense of dislocation from what I knew to be real, but what I could see in front of me. There was another question related to, have I talked with any Israelis in Canada? So not Israelis in Canada. I'm trying to think at the moment, do I know, I don't know that there's anybody in my personal circle who has a dual citizenship, who is Israeli in Canada, but certainly Jewish Canadians that I have met more Jewish Canadians during this last year and a half through involvement in activism than I have known in the past, because certainly we have to make that distinction between what is Jewish and what is Israeli, and to acknowledge that just like people in Gaza, people in Israel exist across the political spectrum. So I have worked with numerous Jewish Canadian colleagues and new friends, and I've also had some contacts with Israeli people in Israel who are working, physicians who are working there from Israel to try to act on behalf of the Gazan healthcare workers who are in Israeli jails, and who are trying from their side to right what they also see as an astronomical injustice that is being done to Palestinians. So the question is, the short version of the question is, why isn't the world more concerned about what's going on in Palestine? I just don't get it. Me neither. So the question, I'll just say for the people online, the question began with acknowledging that that this has essentially been going on since 1948, and why does it continue? Why don't we say anything? And I ask myself this every day. I especially look at physicians and say, how did we take that oath? How did we set ourselves up that we claim that we are these very moral beings, that we deserve a special kind of respect, that we're the guardians of lives? How do we still say that we are, but we annex out Palestinian lives? We're there for Ukrainian lives. We don't seem to know anything about Sudanese lives or Congolese lives, and we actively suppress medical staff who are speaking out on behalf of Palestinian lives. So I cannot explain it or understand it, but I do think that it relates to some quite ingrained racism that we have against Palestinian people and against Muslim people in general, that we've been fed a narrative from our media, from our entertainment, about Islamic religion, about the culture in Muslim countries, about traditions, about cultural practices, that it's so contrary to what I have ever experienced living and working in the Middle East. And I mean, this is Iraq, it's Syria, it's Palestine. All I've experienced is aggressive warmth and a desire to feed me until I burst. And it's so, you know, when I heard this song "Bread and Roses," you know, if you could throw in calligraphy and poetry, then you would kind of have Palestinian masculinity in a nutshell. But you turn on the television, and that's not what you will see. So I think that in part it's coming from a racist ideology that's been imparted to us, because for many people, they don't have a chance to see firsthand. We get isolated small encounters with individual people, but we don't really have a chance to engage with a culture. And then we get what the news and what the films feed us. And then I've got a comment here online that's relevant for this, that we need to take that into account. We need to take our assumption. Sorry, I'm going to start that sentence again. I wish that life was like the video recording that we could edit. So we need to take this into account when we look at a world that has never supported Palestine, that has never defended Palestine, when we look at the Palestinian resistance. So this is the comment which says, "We cannot fault Palestinians for resisting. Whether we agree or not, they have the right to self-defense, especially when the world turns a blind eye to their genocide." And I've seen a newspaper article as well saying, how are the Palestinians allowed to resist? They do nonviolent resistance, nobody notices. They do violent resistance, everybody blames them. So what is allowed? We haven't created any theater in which we allow Palestinian people to act, it seems. Yeah. So the question is about what about support within Gaza during preceding years before October 2023, during the siege. So Egypt used to support Gaza, but then there was a change in government in Egypt, and so they cut off relations with Hamas, and they no longer supported Gaza. Egypt has always played a role in terms of negotiating and hosting negotiations between Israel and Hamas, which has been important. But in terms of directly aiding people in Palestine, no. Egypt did open the Rafah border crossing in, I think it would have been spring of 2021 that it started to function like a normal border crossing, and people could go out. It was still expensive to get to the airport in Cairo. It was still a travel experience with a lot of checkpoints, but at least people were able to move out of Gaza, which had not been the case for the preceding 12 years. Qatar has financially supported Gaza. So in the years when I was there, Qatar would send financial aid, and that would be given to the poorest families in Gaza, and they would receive a cash handout from Qatar. So I think we should wrap things up. And so this last comment that I tried to type some of this for the people that are on the Zoom here, but the last statement ended with the fact that going to Palestine, be it Gaza or the West Bank, is life-changing, and I would second that. There are so many things that are very important things that we can do from here at home, but for those people that are able to go to the West Bank, or I hope someday to Gaza, if that opportunity ever crosses your path, if it were me, I would take it in a heartbeat, because it is life-changing, and the strength of the connections that I've made with people in Gaza, even in that short 2 months when I was there at first, that's what kept me going back again and again and again. And that is also what has given me the platform from which to reach other people and to speak with other people. And I hope to do a little bit more good than what I can do with my own 2 hands.